In the beautiful village of Zuwala, where the air always smelled of fresh earth and the birds sang songs at sunrise, lived a young woman named Sama. She was the kind of person everyone wished to have in their family, gentle, respectful, and always ready to help others. Her laughter brought joy, and her presence brought peace. Elders blessed her, children followed her around, and even strangers felt welcome in her company. People often said she was the flower of Zuwala, blooming with love and goodness. Sama's life seemed like a sweet story when she married Kanu, a man whose good looks and confident voice made many women in the village sigh in admiration. He spoke kindly, carried himself with pride, and charmed everyone with his presence. The villagers danced and sang for days, believing Sama had truly been blessed with a perfect husband. But what no one knew was that Kanu's charm was only on the surface. Inside him was something darker, something that would soon change everything. Like fire hidden under dry leaves, his true nature was waiting to rise, and when it did, it would burn the happiness everyone thought would last forever. After the joyful wedding celebrations ended and the songs of happiness faded into quiet days, a dark change began to unfold in Sama's life. Kanu, the man who once spoke gently and smiled brightly, began to show a completely different side of himself. His soft words turned into harsh commands. His smile disappeared, replaced by a cold, proud look in his eyes. He no longer treated Sama with love and care. Instead, his words cut like knives, and his actions became rough and cruel. He would shout over the smallest things, throw things in anger, and blame Sama for everything that went wrong in the house. The man everyone had praised was no longer there. What remained was a proud, angry, and heartless husband. Sama, who once believed her marriage would be full of joy, now walked on eggshells every day. Still, she kept her pain hidden. She thought maybe it was just a phase. Maybe he was just tired. Maybe he would change. She told herself that if she loved him enough, he would become the kind man she first knew. But love, no matter how deep, cannot fix a heart filled with pride and darkness. Kanu no longer cared about her feelings. He would speak to her like she was a servant, not a wife. Sometimes he wouldn't even speak at all, just glare at her, like her very presence irritated him. And yet, Sama remained quiet. Even when his voice thundered through the house, even when his hand raised in anger, she said nothing. She carried his child in her womb and hoped that one day he would change for the sake of the baby. She smiled in front of others, hiding her pain behind tired eyes and a trembling heart. Her silence was not weakness, it was hope. She wanted to protect her child from stress and protect her husband from shame, but no one knew the battles she was fighting inside. The villagers began to notice that something was wrong. The light in Sama's eyes was dimming. Her laughter had vanished. Her steps had become slower, heavier. The same woman who once glowed with joy now looked like a shadow of herself. Whispers started to rise among the villagers. Women who passed by her house heard shouting. Some saw bruises on her arms. The elders, wise and quiet, watched in silence, shaking their heads. They knew what was happening, but no one dared to interfere. In Zuwala, some believed a wife must endure all for the sake of peace. But even peace comes at a price. And still, through all the pain and humiliation, Sama defended Kanu. When others asked if she was okay, she forced a smile and said, "I'm fine." When someone hinted that Kanu was not treating her right, she quickly changed the subject. She wanted to believe that the man she married still lived somewhere inside him. She wanted to protect the name of her husband, even as he broke her spirit day by day. Pregnant and fragile, Sama continued to live under the same roof as a man who no longer saw her worth. But fate was watching. The spirits of Zuwala were watching. And while Kanu walked proudly, believing no one could challenge him, destiny had already begun preparing a lesson he would never forget. Each morning, Sama would quietly slip away from the house and walk to the edge of the Rukani River, her favorite place since childhood. There, with the soft breeze touching her skin and the gentle sound of water flowing beside her, she found a moment of peace, a small escape from the storm inside her home. She would sit beneath the shade of the old baobab tree, resting her hands gently on her round belly, and whisper softly to the child growing inside her. Her voice was filled with love, even though her heart carried so much pain. She would often speak words only the wind could hear. "My child," she'd say with tears in her eyes, "you are my hope. You are the light in my darkness. I will protect your soul, even if mine is breaking. You will not grow up in hate. You will rise above pain." These quiet moments by the river became her secret strength. No matter how cruel Kanu became, no matter how heavy her heart felt, Sama would return to the Rukani River to remind herself of the life she was carrying, a life worth fighting for. Though bruises marked her body and sadness rested behind her tired eyes, Sama refused to let bitterness enter her heart. She still greeted neighbors with soft smiles. She still helped elderly women carry their baskets. Her spirit was hurting, but her kindness never faded. Deep inside her, a silent strength was growing, stronger than pain, stronger than fear. She knew that if she gave in to anger, her child would feel it too. So she fought every day, not with fists or words, but with love, quiet love, silent courage. But fate has a way of turning silence into screams. One day, as the sun burned high in the sky and the village bustled with daily life, a loud commotion erupted near the market square. Villagers rushed out of their homes to see what was happening. And there, in the open street, stood Kanu, his eyes burning with rage, his voice thundering through the air. He was shouting at Sama, pulling her by the arm. Her clothes were torn, her face filled with fear, but she didn't resist. She stood there, trembling, shielding her belly with both hands, trying to protect the child inside her. But Kanu's fury had no end. In front of everyone, in front of the same people who once danced at their wedding, he raised his hand and struck her. Gasps filled the air. Women covered their mouths in shock. Men froze in disbelief. Children clung to their mothers. No one had ever expected to see such cruelty under the sun of Zuwala. And yet, there it was. Sama, the gentle soul of the village, beaten in the street by the very man she once called her love. But even in that moment, Sama didn't scream. She didn't curse. She simply held her belly tighter, eyes full of tears, but also something more, something deep, silent, and unshakable. Strength. That day, the village saw not just her pain, but also the powerful spirit she carried within her, a spirit that would not break, a fire that still burned, quietly, beneath all the suffering. And though Kanu believed he had silenced her forever, he did not know. He had just awakened something that would one day change everything. It was a bright market day in the village of Zuwala. The sun glowed gently over the rooftops. Children ran barefoot in the dust, and the air buzzed with voices of traders, laughter, and bargaining. The scent of roasted maize and fresh herbs filled the air, and women with colorful baskets balanced on their heads moved gracefully between stalls. Everything felt lively, peaceful, just like any other day. But what happened next would stain that day forever in the memory of every soul present. Suddenly, a piercing scream broke through the noise, silencing the laughter and turning heads in every direction. It was the kind of scream that made hearts stop. Then, from between the crowd, came Kanu, his eyes wild with rage, his steps heavy and staggering. His breath smelled of palm wine, and his voice thundered with anger. He was dragging Sama, pregnant, weak, and trembling, by her arm into the middle of the street like a criminal. People stood still, shocked and unsure of what they were witnessing. Kanu's voice roared, full of hate and poison. He accused her loudly of things she never did, shouting words too foul for even enemies. He called her worthless, insulted her family, and spat at her feet. Some women tried to step forward, but fear held them back. Others whispered to each other in disbelief. Sama stood there, her eyes filled with tears, trying to protect her stomach, hoping it was just another moment of madness that would soon pass. But then, it happened. Kanu raised his hand and slapped her across the face. Once, twice, and before anyone could move, he delivered a brutal kick right to her belly. Gasps rose like a wave. Mothers screamed. Some men ran toward them to stop him, but the damage had already been done. Sama fell to her knees, holding her stomach, crying in pain and fear. The entire market froze. It was as though time itself had paused in horror. Even the children, who moments ago were laughing, stood silently with wide eyes. Just then, through the crowd, stepped Elder Nomoke, one of the oldest and most respected men in Zuwala. His presence was like thunder before rain. He walked straight toward Kanu, eyes burning with disappointment and anger. The people made way for him without a word. He looked at Kanu, not with fear, but with the strength of wisdom. "You fool!" Elder Nomoke shouted. "You strike not just a woman, you strike life itself. That child is innocent, and so is the mother who carries it. May the spirits of Zuwala see this day. May they witness your shame." But Kanu, proud and blinded by his anger, only laughed. He didn't care about curses or spirits. He turned his back on the elder and walked away, still muttering cruel words. What he didn't know was that his laughter had sealed his fate, because in Zuwala, when a curse is spoken from the heart of an elder, and when the spirits are watching, it always finds its way. That day, Kanu thought he had broken Sama. He thought he had won, but destiny had already begun writing the story of his downfall. The same child he tried to destroy would one day rise, not just to survive, but to become the very fire that would bring him to his knees. That evening, after the horror of what happened in the marketplace, a heavy silence fell over the village of Zuwala. The news of Kanu's violent act spread quickly, like fire through dry grass. No one spoke loudly, but everyone was talking. Eyes were filled with fear and hearts weighed with anger. The elders, the most respected voices in the village, could not remain silent. A sacred meeting was called under the great fig tree near the village shrine, where generations had gathered for wisdom and justice. The council of elders sat in a circle, their faces grim. Elder Namoke, wise and deeply respected, rose to speak. His voice was calm but firm, echoing through the night air. "Bring Kanu," he commanded. Kanu arrived, shoulders high and pride glowing on his face, as if he had done nothing wrong. He stood in front of the council, arrogant and unbothered, even as villagers gathered at a distance to watch quietly. Elder Namoki stepped forward, his eyes piercing straight into Kanu's soul. "Kanu," he said slowly, "what you did today was not only an abomination, it was a curse upon your own blood. You struck your wife, who carries life within her. The spirits of Zuwala do not sleep. They have seen it all. They do not forgive such evil easily. You must repent. You must kneel and ask for mercy before the earth itself takes revenge." But Kanu only laughed. With no shame, he spat on the ground in front of the elders. "I fear no spirits," he shouted, his voice proud and loud. "I am a man. I rule my house, and no old man or spirit can tell me how to live." A cold wind passed through the gathering, and everyone felt it. Something had shifted. Even the animals nearby grew restless. And though the sky was clear, thunder suddenly rumbled in the distance. The villagers looked up. There were no clouds, no sign of rain. Yet the thunder came again, louder this time. It was as if the spirits were answering. That same night, as the village held its breath in fear of what was to come, Sama's pain began. Her body, still bruised and weak from the beating, trembled with early labor. It was too soon. Her time had not yet come, but the child inside her was determined to enter the world. Sama cried in pain, her hands gripping tightly onto the sheets. Some women from the village came to help her, tears in their eyes as they saw her condition. But Sama didn't complain. Even through her pain, she held strength in her soul. Hours passed, and finally, a cry broke through the night air, the cry of a baby boy. He was small, but his voice was loud and fierce, as if he had carried the thunder with him from the heavens. The women looked at each other, stunned by the strange power in his cry, and when they placed him in Sama's arms, she smiled softly and whispered, "Nyoma, child of thunder." From that moment, everyone knew this child was no ordinary baby. He was born not just from pain, but from prophecy. And while Kanu slept in pride and ignorance, he had no idea that the very child he tried to destroy had now become the spirit's answer to his cruelty, and would one day bring the storm he thought would never come. Nyoma's birth was unlike any other in the history of Zuwala. As the first light of dawn touched the village rooftops, strange clouds still hovered above, and the rumble of thunder echoed softly through the hills. Though the sky remained clear, it was as if the heavens had not yet finished speaking. Sama, though weak from the beating and the difficult birth, held her newborn son in her arms. Her eyes were tired but full of wonder. The child was quiet, unusually calm. He didn't cry like most newborns. He only stared, wide-eyed and still, as if studying the world for the first time, or perhaps remembering a world he had left behind. The midwives exchanged uneasy glances. Then, old healer Fowler entered the room, her steps slow, her eyes sharp with wisdom gathered through many seasons. As she looked at the baby, she froze. Her wrinkled fingers gently turned the baby's tiny hand. On his palm was a strange mark, shaped like a serpent's eye, dark and mysterious, unlike anything anyone had ever seen. Gasps filled the small hut. Fowler's voice trembled as she spoke. "This child," she whispered, "carries something ancient, something beyond our understanding. His spirit is older than this village." older than the hills. Sama looked down at her son and felt a strange warmth in her chest. She didn't fear him. She felt peace. She pulled him close and whispered softly into his ear, "Live, my son. Grow strong. Become what your father could never be. You are not cursed. You are chosen." But outside, the story was different. Kanu stood in the doorway, watching them coldly. His eyes didn't soften at the sight of his newborn child. Instead, he stared with bitterness and fear. To him, the mark on Neoma's hand was not a sign of mystery. It was a curse, a punishment from the spirits he had mocked. His heart, already darkened by pride and violence, now burned with hatred toward the child he had never wanted. He didn't step forward. He didn't hold the boy. He simply turned away and muttered to himself, "This boy is not mine. He brings nothing but bad omen. I will not raise a cursed child." Sama heard him, but she said nothing. Her tears were dry now. Her strength had become quiet and deep, like a river under stone. She knew in that moment that she was truly alone, but she also knew she had something greater than any man's love. She had Neoma, and Neoma, whether cursed or chosen, was her purpose now. Kanu left the house that night and didn't return. Some say he went to drink. Others say he wandered into the dark forests to escape his guilt. But what everyone knew was this: he had abandoned them. And yet, despite the cruelty and fear, something sacred had been born. A child like no other. A child who carried the echo of thunder in his silence. A child whose eyes held ancient wisdom. A child whose story was only beginning, and whose presence would one day shake the very ground that his father walked on. Years passed quietly, but Neoma's presence was anything but ordinary. From the moment he began to speak, it was clear he was different. His voice was soft yet powerful, and his eyes always seemed to look beyond what others could see. He grew taller and stronger with each season, but it wasn't just his body that was growing, it was his spirit. People in the village started noticing strange, yet beautiful things about him. When Neoma walked through the forest, the wind would whisper through the trees, almost like it was greeting him. Birds would perch on his shoulders and sing to him. Injured animals found their way to him, and with just a touch of his hands, they would begin to heal. Even the plants in his mother's garden grew taller and greener than those in the rest of Zuwala. Children followed him, curious and amazed. The elders watched him silently, whispering among themselves. And slowly, what was once fear began to change into something else: wonder. One day, old Folkl, now walking slowly with a stick, stood before the villagers in the gathering square. Her voice, though old, was steady and filled with truth. "This child is not ordinary," she said. "He carries the spirit's breath. He is the vessel of the ancients. Protect him, or suffer the wrath of the spirits." From that day, the people looked at Neoma with respect. They greeted him with lowered eyes. They left gifts outside Summer's hut, calabashes of honey, woven mats, fruits from distant lands. They didn't worship him, but they feared the power he carried within. But not everyone was pleased. Kanu, now a broken man, watched from a distance. He had become a shadow of the proud, arrogant man he once was. His wealth had disappeared, his name lost in shame. He had remarried a woman named Balita, loud and greedy, who insulted him daily for his uselessness. She had no respect for him, and no love either. She often mocked him for abandoning Sama and Neoma. "You left a woman of gold and a child of power for dust and disgrace," she would laugh. "You are a man who curses his own destiny." Kanu boiled in silence, but deep down, he knew she was right. Still, Neoma, now a tall boy with calm strength, never spoke badly of his father. He would pass Kanu in the village, bow his head respectfully, and continue walking. He held no hatred in his heart. He simply understood. He had grown wiser than his years, and he knew bitterness only eats the one who carries it. But fate, like a silent river, was flowing toward a moment that would change everything. One morning, as the sun painted the sky in orange and gold, a strange messenger arrived in Zuwala. He wore robes of deep green and carried a staff carved with old symbols. He came from a distant land, speaking of visions and a rising darkness. He said a chosen one would rise and bring balance. And as he looked into Neoma's eyes, he smiled softly. "The circle is not yet complete," he said, "but soon it will be." And from that moment, everyone knew the boy with the spirit's gift was no longer just a child. He was the storm that destiny had been waiting for. Kanu's fall was slow at first, like the wind before a storm, barely noticed, yet full of warning. His once thriving crops began to wither under the sun. The green leaves turned brown, the soil cracked, and no amount of water could save them. His goats, once fat and lively, grew weak and died one after another. Their bodies found lifeless, without explanation. People whispered about curses. Some said the spirits were angry. Others said it was karma catching up. Kanu tried to ignore it. He blamed the weather, the soil, even the gods. But deep inside, fear had begun to grow like a shadow in his heart. Then the nightmares began. Every night, Kanu screamed in his sleep. He would wake up drenched in sweat, eyes wide with terror. He claimed to see dark figures standing by his bed, whispering, laughing, pointing at him. He started hearing voices during the day too, soft murmurs no one else could hear. He walked through the village muttering to himself, his eyes darting around like a hunted man. People started avoiding him. Children hid when he passed. Even Balita, his loud and greedy wife, grew frightened. She began sleeping in a separate room, clutching charms and calling on local healers. But nothing helped. One day, in a fit of madness, Kanu stormed towards Sama's house. His eyes were wild, his body shaking. He shouted terrible things, blaming her and Neoma for all his misfortune. "Witches!" he roared. "You cursed my life. You brought this darkness upon me." He raised his hand again, trying to strike Sama like he once had. But before his hand could even reach her, Neoma stepped forward, calm, tall, and unmoved. "You will not touch her again," Neoma said, his voice low but powerful. "The spirits you mocked now walk with me." There was no anger in Neoma's voice, only truth. It was as though the wind itself paused to listen. Kanu's hand froze in the air, his legs gave way, and suddenly he dropped to the ground, shaking and sobbing like a helpless child. He clutched his head, crying, begging unseen shadows to leave him alone. His voice cracked in fear, no longer the voice of a man, but of someone lost to madness. The villagers gathered silently. No one said a word. They all watched as the mighty man who once ruled with pride now lay broken in the dust. No one dared to help him. No one dared to speak. Balita, terrified and ashamed, packed her things and disappeared from the village that same night. She left Kanu behind, alone, broken, and lost in his madness. He was no longer a husband, a father, or a man of respect. He was just a haunted soul, talking to shadows, feared by all. His once proud hut became a place of silence and whispers. No one dared enter. Some said his laughter echoed at night. Others claimed they saw him talking to empty corners. Whatever truth lay behind the stories, one thing was clear. Kanu's downfall had begun the moment he raised his hand against the innocent, and now he was living with the curse he created himself. Neoma grew tall and strong, but it wasn't just his body that became powerful. It was his heart, his spirit, and his wisdom. He walked like a man born of light and spoke with the calmness of the river. People from faraway villages came to hear his words, to seek his healing hands, and to witness the gift he carried from the spirits. They called him the one who listens to the wind, for he always knew what people needed before they even spoke. He never used his strength to boast. Instead, he used it to protect the weak, to heal the sick, and to comfort the broken. With his mother by his side, Neoma built a sanctuary in the heart of Zuwala, a place where women who had been beaten, rejected, or mistreated could find peace and shelter. He taught the children lessons of kindness and wisdom. Under the shade of the great baobab tree, he turned pain into purpose, and Zuwala became a land of healing and hope. His story spread beyond the rivers and hills. People sang songs of the boy born in thunder, the child who carried the mark of the serpent's eye, the healer who came from sorrow but rose like a king. Neoma had become a legend, not because of magic, but because he chose love over hate, forgiveness over vengeance, and light over darkness. One quiet afternoon, after teaching a group of young boys how to plant healing herbs, Neoma walked alone to the edge of the village. There, hidden beneath a cloak of overgrown vines and rotting wood, stood his father's old hut. The once proud house now looked like a forgotten grave. The roof sagged, the walls were cracked, the door creaked in the wind like a whisper from the past. Inside, Kanu lay on a mat, frail and withered, his eyes clouded with blindness. His skin was pale, his breath shallow. He had become a shadow of the man he once was. The villagers no longer spoke his name. He was the man who cursed himself, the one left behind by time. When Neoma stepped into the hut, Kanu trembled. He turned his face toward the sound of the footsteps, sensing who it was. With a shaking voice, Kanu whispered, Forgive me. I was a fool. I was blind even before my eyes failed me. Nyoma stood silently for a moment, looking at the man who had once caused his mother so much pain, who had tried to destroy him before he was even born. But there was no anger in his heart, only truth. I do not hate you, Nyoma said gently, but the pain you caused still lives in the wind. You beat a woman who carried a king. Kanu's lips quivered. His eyes, though blind, filled with tears. He wept, not just from regret, but from the weight of what he had lost. A son who had become greater than he ever dreamed to be. A legacy he had tried to destroy, but could never stop. But forgiveness cannot always undo damage, and sometimes sorrow comes too late. Nyoma turned and walked away, leaving behind the broken man and the broken past. And the wind, gentle and steady, carried his footsteps like a song, whispering to the world that strength is not in fists, but in forgiveness, and that those who harm the innocent will one day kneel before the ones they tried to break. Kanu's end was as bitter as his deeds. He died alone in the same broken hut where he had once roared with pride. No family surrounded him. No friends wept for him. He spent his final days whispering to the shadows, hoping for forgiveness, but the shadows gave him no answers. The village didn't mourn him. His grave was marked by nothing more than rough stones, silent reminders of a man who chose cruelty over love, pride over peace. But while Kanu faded into silence, Sama rose into light. The woman who once walked with bruises on her skin and sorrow in her eyes, now walked tall, with dignity. She became a symbol of strength in Zuwala, a woman who endured pain without losing her heart, who raised a child of greatness despite being broken. The people no longer saw her as a victim. They called her Mother of the Spirit Blessed. Women from all corners of the land came to hear her speak, to hold her hands, to sit by her feet, and listen to her story of survival and strength. Nyoma, now a man of wisdom and honor, looked at his mother with pride burning in his heart. He knew her strength had shaped him. Her tears had watered the roots of his destiny. In a grand village ceremony, he made an unforgettable announcement. He renamed the village. No longer would it be called Zuwala. From that day forward, it would be known as Samaru, land of Sama. The villagers cheered. Drums echoed through the hills. Dancers filled the streets. The woman who was once beaten in front of them was now being honored before them. She became the living proof that pain does not define a person. How they rise from it does. And so, the tale of Sama and Nyoma became a legend passed from mouth to mouth, from generation to generation. It taught the world a lesson that pierced every heart. Never destroy a woman carrying a child, for within her may lie the spirit of your judgment. Sama's story was not just about survival. It was about transformation. It was about how, even in the darkest soil, a seed of greatness can grow. It was about how one woman's strength became the root of a legacy that shook the heavens. Kanu was forgotten, but Sama's name lived on, etched in every corner of Samaru, spoken in every song of praise, and carried in every heart that dared to rise above pain. If this story touched your heart, then remember, there are countless women like Sama in this world, silently carrying pain, yet rising with strength that can shake the heaven. Sama's journey reminds us that no matter how cruel life may seem, there is always hope, there is always light, and there is always redemption. Her pain became power, her tears gave birth to a legend, and her name, once whispered in sorrow, is now sung in glory. So, what lesson did you take from this story? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your voice. Share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that no one can dim the light of a strong heart. Let this message reach every corner of the world. And if you want more powerful, emotional, and inspiring stories like this one, don't forget to like the video, share it with your friends, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel so you never miss another heart-touching story. Your support helps us keep telling stories that heal, inspire, and transform.
पासवर्ड दे कुछ ना करे वीडियो बनाना भी है करेगा
वीडियो थमा
ये ओके
बना देवनी मैं पोसी
और मैंने वो पढ़ेगा फ्री कंटेंट डालो
बड़ा काल में बड़ा सराबत बना दे चलो
स्लैब वाला नहीं बनना था
अफ्रीका नल तक मैं बना दे संतो स्लैब ले बना दे
स्लैब वाली ओके अफ्रीका ना ओके तू यो कर मैं को सिखा चलो
मैं अपने वीडियो बनाना बैठा है तो भैया लाऊंगे 5-7 मिनट में मोबाइल तो ना बनाना बैठा ये गुलामने कॉपीराइट ना लग से
ते हर ऊपर ये लावनी है नहीं लावनी
ये जरूरी है
मैं अपनी बड़ा बनाऊंगा ना मैं बता अपनी बनाऊंगी ना मैं बनाऊंगी
आपने तुम बड़ा 5 मिनट में बना था
और टीचर को लो
आईफोन है
अगर उन्हें पसंद आ गया तो वाला सलवार इंच नहीं उठाई
हाँ
वैसे
मैं तो दाढ़ी वाला ना
मैं सलवार में तो कोई
यो इफेक्ट न लावे ओरिजिनल तो बनावे फ्रंट
एक लगा है यार इनका कैमरे का
ओरिजिनल तो लगा तो कौन है इशू
इफेक्ट वो संग इफेक्ट आ गया बड़ा लगता है
सांगे को वीडियो वास्ते तो कौन थोड़ी बने लगड़ा होता है यही
तो
वास्ते
सब ने जो बना खड़ाई
वो स्नैप तो बने लगड़ा हो तो उनके वास्ते बने पिया वैसे चल वीडियो वैसे ये फ्रंट खोलें जाते फ्रंट तो आपने बनावेगा 5 मिनट दिए हुए यार कैश खड़ा तो मैं तो बना दे सा अफ्रीकन वाली तू बना के स्लैब वाली वास्ते वो अपने पीसी तो या शादी वाले तो बना था
मैंने पिछले का कॉल इशू से वाला उठाए उनका पासवर्ड दिया
पासवर्ड तक मैं पूछ देना तो वीडियो बनावाना लबान पासवर्ड तक करने मसला पासवर्ड बनाना तक कर देना कोई इशू नहीं
भाग दे वीडियो पे बनते थे जो कोई घंटा बेटा 45 घंटे बड़ी
हाँ तो टिकटॉक पे तो स्टेटस लग सकता है ये बन संगे
अबे ये वीडियो टिकटॉक पर बड़ी होती है मेरे को वो चाट
आपने तो ही तो बना फ्रंट कैमरा तो बना
तब मेरे एक नबिया तरीका से ना तू कोई यानी के इंग्लिश उर्दू इंग्लिश बनवा चाहे इंग्लिश भाई असलम अलैकुम तो सही की तरह तो आपने फोटो ला के तो इंग्लिश डिवाइस करा के ला रहे
वो कैसे वैसा वैसा ही तो नहीं लाने ये जिम्मे आवाज सारा वैसा पे ही बन जाते सो
नहीं तो यूएस से आया तो कैस कुछ कहना ना मेरी बना तो मेरी न बना तो तरीका का है
कैसे ना
असीना
यार वीडियो चूर ढीला है देखो ओ माय गॉड ये क्या